Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to the 2024 AROHE Summit. I'm Eric Hockert, AROHE board member and past president of the University of Minnesota Retirees Association. I'd like to thank Rhodes Scholar for their sponsorship of today's event. Today we're going to hear about social relationships, a key to a happy and successful retirement. There will be a question and answer session following the presentation. At any time during the presentation, you can click on the Q&A icon on your screen to bring up a window where you can type your question. After the presentation, I will moderate the Q&A session. Our presenter slides and a video recording of today's Zoom will be made available later on the AROHE website. I'm pleased to welcome our guest today, Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience and Director of the Social Connection and Health Lab at Brigham Young University. She is also the founding scientific chair and board member for the U.S. Foundation for Social Connection and the Global Initiative on Loneliness and Connection. Her research focuses on the individual and population health effects, biological mechanisms, and effective strategies to mitigate risk and promote protection associated with social connection. She has given a TED Talk and given expert advice and testimony internationally to many organizations, including being the lead scientific editor for a U.S. Surgeon General's advisory and framework for a national strategy. Dr. Holt-Lunstad, welcome, and now over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'll go ahead and really start my presentation, but just so honored and grateful to be here today. So before I begin, of course, I want to acknowledge the contributions of my collaborators and those who contributed to this work. And you know, it's not surprising that as I'm talking about social connection and some of the risks associated with isolation, well, this work was not done in isolation. So a big thank you to all those who contributed and supported this work. So many people are becoming somewhat obsessed with living past 100. And not only are there books written about this, there's even a Netflix show that is dedicated to this very idea. But of course, we don't want to just grow old. We want to thrive. This is just an example of a 101-year-old in my neck of the woods in Utah, still skiing at 101. So this is, you know, we want a full, healthy life, not just a long life. So part of my work, I direct an international study program where we go to some of the blue zones, areas where people live long, you know, some of the longest, happiest and healthiest lives. And while I was there, I met both of these centenarians, and the gentleman on the right, it was interesting because as we were talking with him, one of the things that he shared with us was that one of the worst curses that anyone could put on anyone was to wish they were alone. In other words, to wish upon someone that they were isolated. And that was the kind of the worst insult that you could give someone. And so I thought that was really interesting, of course, because interestingly, as we spoke to them also and asked them what they found to be the key to happiness was close family relationships and close relationships with others. And of course, this is not surprising because we have many surveys that over and over again, when asked people, when people are asked, what is the key to their happiness? It's not success or wealth. It's their relationships and close relationships with others. So, it's not surprising that one of the truisms in life is that we often take for granted and don't appreciate what's most important in life until it's taken away. And so the pandemic certainly brought greater awareness to the importance of our social connections for our well-being. But it's really important to recognize that while that, the pandemic certainly raised awareness and brought urgency to finding ways to alleviate isolation and loneliness. This, of course, is not new. We've had data on this for decades, but certainly does help us elevate and recognize the importance of this issue. So this is this idea of a loneliness epidemic certainly did not begin with a pandemic. We saw this, here's just an image from 2018. But we also have additionally, we have nations that are appointing ministers of loneliness to address this on a national level. Our own U.S. Surgeon General has issued an advisory on this topic. And even South Korea is taking the concrete steps of offering isolated young adults a monthly stipend, simply just to re-engage in society. So these concerns really are also illuminated in the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory, which I was honored to serve as the lead scientific editor on. And so my remarks today are going to rely to some extent on the information that is in this, which of course is publicly available, but also draws upon other sources of data as well and evidence. I also wanted to just make you all aware that the World Health Organization is also has established a commission on social connection and is certainly prioritizing this at a global level as well. So today I want to just really focus on a few key questions. And the first is, of course, why should we care about social connection, and just how big of an issue is this? What are the potential health consequences when we lack connection? And how do we prepare for a healthier future? So I want to first start by really just illustrating just the extent to which we should care about this, and to what extent the evidence suggests that there may be a potential problem when it comes to social connection. So for example, when we look at global data, this is data from Meta Gallup Global State of Connection Survey of 142 countries. And on average, what we find is that nearly a quarter of the global population felt very or fairly lonely. Here in the United States, some other sources suggest that approximately 1 in 2 American adults are reporting loneliness. So this is a significant portion of the population. And according to the World Health Organization, social isolation and loneliness affect people of all ages, of course, and worldwide, but 25% of older adults are socially isolated. When we also look at other kinds of trends, we see that this is data from the American Time Use Survey. This is just data that looks at literally how people are using the minutes of their day. And they look at a variety of kinds of outcomes. But in this data that's shown on the screen, and this goes back roughly 20 years, so back to 2003. So what we can see is that isolation has significantly increased over time. Time spent with family, both household and non-household, has declined over time. So has time with friends and other social engagement and companionship. And so again, these kinds of concerns did not begin with the pandemic, but certainly were exacerbated by the pandemic. So we hear a lot about a loneliness epidemic and lonely concerns about loneliness, but what exactly does that mean? And we often hear the term used colloquially as a catch-all term for all forms of lacking connection, but there's a more precise scientific definition. So, and the best way I've found to really help distinguish this is by distinguishing it from social isolation. These are related but distinct terms. Social isolation is objectively being alone, having few relationships or infrequent social contact, whereas loneliness is subjectively feeling alone. The discrepancy between one's desired level of connection and one's actual level of connection. So of course, isolation and loneliness can co-occur, and indeed, being objectively isolated can increase your risk. So objectively being alone can increase your risk of feeling alone. But importantly, they can occur separately. So you can be isolated and not feel lonely, and you can be lonely and not be isolated. Importantly, both are important for health and well-being, and so we need to really pay attention to both. But the way in which we might address them might take different kinds of approaches. Both isolation and loneliness are forms of lacking social connection. And so really to think about then, well, what is social connection? I know this figure might look very complicated, but really social connection can be thought of as an umbrella term that encompasses the many ways in which we can connect to others, including the structure, function, and quality of our connections with others. And so the structure really refers to the existence and interconnections among different relationships. And so it really, in short, gets at the presence or absence of others in our lives. But of course, we don't just need people in our lives. There are the functions that various relationships can serve. And so this can either be the objective received or even perceptions of the availability of support from others. But we also recognize that not all relationships are entirely positive, and so we need to pay attention to the quality as well. So social connection is this umbrella term that encompasses all of these things. And when social connection is high, we see generally that there is low risk. And when social connection is low, we generally see high risk. It's also important to note that when we talk about social connection, this can include social interactions, relationships, and our networks. We often simply think of just our close family and friends, but all are important. And in fact, our relationships with coworkers, supervisors, community members, neighbors, all of these are important, including what are referred to as weak ties. And those are the kinds of encounters and either casual relationships or encounters with others that we have in our everyday lives. And these are also important. So when it comes to social connection, for far too long, we have seen it as something that is nice to have. but in a way almost as something that is optional. And in fact, what the evidence suggests is that social connection is a critical and relatively unappreciated contributor to both individual and population health, well-being, community safety, resilience, and prosperity. Simply put, people who have strong social connections are happier, healthier, and live longer than those who don't. And so I really want to, share with you that what we see is that when we look at the evidence, that human beings are social beings. And this is critical to survival and is considered to be a fundamental need. And so when we look at this biologically, social connection is linked, is considered a biological need linked to survival. And so across social species, we see this as important. So whether that is direction to safety, evading predators, warmth and comfort, protection from the elements, pooling of resources, obtaining food, being part of a group is adaptive for survival, and these are functions that are critical to survival. And of course, humans are social species, and in fact, we're one of the most vulnerable species at birth. And so being part of a group is absolutely essential to human survival, and that extends beyond infancy into adulthood. And so this, from a neuroscience perspective, social connection is seen as a fundamental human need. And so we can think of loneliness as a biological signal, similar to hunger and thirst. So just as hunger might be unpleasant, but motivate you to meet a biological need, loneliness similarly is an unpleasant feeling, but it helps motivate people to reconnect socially to meet that biological need. So we can similarly think of isolation as objectively lacking that biological need. And similarly, if we take that analogy farther, just like food and water are essential to survival, quality matters. And just like food can spoil and water can be unclean, and these can make you sick, when our social connections are poor quality, this may be detrimental as well. And so quality does matter. So what do we know about the potential health consequences? So I was honored to serve as a member of the National Academies of Science Consensus Committee that issued a report on the impact of social isolation and loneliness among older adults. And our committee concluded that there's substantial evidence of strong associations between social isolation and loneliness, with greater incidence of major psychological, cognitive, and physical morbidities and lower well-being or quality of life. And that the findings were particularly strong for risk for premature mortality from all causes. And that this risk was comparable to other risk factors. And so this led our committee to conclude that social isolation is a major public health concern. And I'll note that somewhat ironically, this report was issued and published February 27th, 2020. So literally just 2 weeks before the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. And so we were well aware of the medical and health consequences before the pandemic. This also, some of these conclusions came from various data sources, but among them is looking at the overall magnitude of the effects for premature mortality. And so in looking at the worldwide epidemiological data, this is data from my own research. And what we found was that data from roughly 3.4 million people, we found that loneliness increases risk for earlier death by 26%, social isolation by 29%, and living alone by 32%. And more recently, another meta-analysis of this data more recently similarly found that both loneliness and isolation were significant predictors, with social isolation being significantly stronger compared to perceptions of loneliness. Now, conversely, in an earlier meta-analysis of 148 studies, what we found was that social connection increases survival by 50%. And so this was pretty remarkable because this was even larger. So the protective effects of being socially connected were significantly larger than the effects associated with lacking connection. So given that there's somewhat of a lack of appreciation for just how serious this is, we decided to benchmark these findings relative to other factors that we take quite seriously for our health. And so as you can see here, as depicted in the gold or orange bars, that social connection is comparable or on par with other leading health indicators, which are depicted in the blue bars. So this is comparing it to other factors, including things like smoking, alcohol consumption, flu vaccine, physical activity, obesity, and air pollution. And so what this suggests is that if these are have a similar effect size or effect on mortality risk, that we need to be taking our social connections just as seriously as we take these other factors for our health. So really, what I'd like to just emphasize is that, of course, these effects were not only robust, but these were consistent across cause of death. And I'll note that the majority of these findings were disease-related causes of death. Also, we found that both objective and subjective indicators predict risk, and that this was independent of many of the other factors that we would normally consider to be important predictors. So of course it was independent of age, independent of health status, and in some cases independent of other kinds of lifestyle factors. Now, importantly, we also have good evidence that lacking connection can impact not only our mental health and our well-being, but of course physical health, including things like heart disease, stroke, dementia, type 2 diabetes, and as we just talked about, premature death. And so all of these are important outcomes. And so oftentimes when we think of loneliness, it's that tip of the iceberg. But what is lying beneath there and that uncomfortable feeling is what may potentially lead to more serious kinds of consequences. Now, what is important to note is that we don't just have these interesting associations between social connections and these outcomes, but rather we are learning about and have evidence of many of the important pathways by which this can occur. So having people in our lives can influence our lifestyle, psychological factors, including things like stress, depression, resilience, and hopefulness. It can also influence our medical adherence, all of which these can have objective influences on biomarkers, which if sustained over time can increase our risk for morbidity and ultimately earlier mortality. So we do have evidence that social connection is a biologically based human need that is linked to physical health, but unfortunately it isn't adequately recognized or addressed. So many people wonder, well, who might be most at risk for isolation and loneliness? And what I'd like to first emphasize is literally anyone can be at risk because no one is immune. Given that this is such a central human fundamental need, any one of us can feel lonely. Any one of us can potentially become isolated. However, some groups tend to have higher prevalence rates of loneliness. So for example, research consistently shows that those who report having poor mental or physical health are also reporting higher loneliness. And that this seems to be a bidirectional association. So not only can this increase our risk for developing poor mental health and physical health, but when we are in poor health, it also increases our risk of becoming isolated. And so it can become potentially a vicious and reinforcing cycle. There's also evidence that those who live alone, those who are struggling economically, and those who identify as being a member of a marginalized or minoritized group all report higher levels of isolation and loneliness. This, of course, is important and relevant for aging. And so as a society, we have an increased aging population. And interestingly, given the trends that we're seeing in our demographics, we also show that we have fewer informal social resources as we age. From an aging perspective also, what we're seeing is that the young are becoming less socially connected from previous generations. And so these early life experiences can predict later social outcomes as well as physical health outcomes. And so not only do we need to be particularly concerned about those who are already aged, but we need to be considered, look at all of us as we age and aging across the trajectory and aging across the life course. So when do we need to act? And when should we start planning socially for retirement? And I would say the time is now. And just as we plan for retirement financially, we need to be planning for retirement socially. And just as it's important to start that early and not wait until you're retired to plan financially, similarly, you would want to do the same socially. And so we really need to start investing early in our social, our social environment. And so when we think about, why we should be investing in social connection, given that it's such a strong predictor of health, happiness, and well-being, unfortunately, what we find is that we take this for granted. We don't invest in it. In fact, some of the data suggests that 80% of health outcomes are attributable to non-medical determinants of well-being, one of which is social connection. And of course, I've talked about the mortality rates, but interestingly, what we find is that the proportion of healthcare spending dedicated to health promotion and prevention is only about 3.5%. So we're simply not investing in preventative kinds of efforts. And certainly investing in our social connections is going to be really important for that. And so, as we think about how to invest in this, but also how to address this, is we need to think about social connection as a continuum, and every one of us somewhere along the continuum. And yet, unfortunately, oftentimes what is most highly invested in is among those that are at the most extreme end, the most at high risk, which of course is appropriate because they have the individuals that fall on that end of the spectrum have high needs. But what's unfortunate is that it often misses the rest of the risk trajectory that could potentially benefit. And so if we invest in more societal level kinds of approaches and preventative kinds of approaches, we have the opportunity to shift the trajectory. And so one way to do this is through really thinking about social connection like we do other kinds of national health guidelines, and really think about not only, fitting in our exercise, fitting in our 5 fruits and vegetables a day. We need to make sure that we are prioritizing social connection as well. And so this is not only something that that I have published about, but is one of the recommendations in the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory, is establishing national health guidelines to help guide us in that way. But it's also important to note that this is not just a personal issue. And so I think far too many individuals feel like it's on their shoulders to really address this themselves. And what we really need is a whole of society approach. And in fact, many people will report that that the factors that have increased risk for isolation and loneliness are things that may have been outside of their control. And as certainly one of the lessons we learned from the pandemic is that that there can be external forces that can contribute to our isolation and loneliness. So I want to leave you with some of the recommendations from the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory in this, and 6 pillars to advance social connection. And so the first is to really strengthen the social infrastructure in local communities. And so this is important to invest in the places and spaces that are going to promote social connection. The second is to enact pro-social connection public policies, and recognizing that all policies may potentially impact people socially. And so we need to not only think about policies that can promote social connection, but how are our existing policies, whether they be privacy policies or workplace policies or healthcare policies, how might they potentially be barriers to connection? Maybe it's even a zoning policy in a neighborhood. If we need to reevaluate those kinds of policies. The third is to mobilize the health sector. So we know that there are substantial health implications that stem from lacking connection. And so our healthcare providers need to be adequately trained and resourced to deal with this in clinical settings. The fourth is to potentially reform digital environments. We know that that technology and digital means of connecting can have both benefits and harms. And so implementing appropriate safety standards may be an avenue to pursue in a way that can maximize the benefits and minimize the harms. The fifth is just to deepen our knowledge. And not only is this to raise to increase our awareness of the evidence that we already have, but this is also a way to increase our understanding of this as well. Finally, it's to build a culture of connection. And so we can build places, we can develop programs, we can implement policies. But if these do not align with our norms, they will fall flat. And we need to cultivate values of kindness, respect, service, and commitment to one another, and to model these values in every sphere of influence in which we find ourselves. So I just want to close by sharing this picture of my son, who is in Italy with some gentlemen there. And as we think of how to connect, we often look to these blue zones for examples, but we don't need to travel all the way to Italy or to a blue zone to find these, and that we can find connection in whatever community that we find ourselves. So I want to just end by asking you to imagine that there's a new drug on the market, and this medication can increase your survival by as much as 50%. Reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease by 29%. Reduce your risk for stroke by 32%. It can also reduce your risk of developing depression, and if you have depression, it can reduce the severity of that depression. It also reduces your likelihood of developing dementia. It can even increase your immune response, making you less susceptible to cold and flu viruses. And better yet, it has few, if any, side effects and can actually increase your well-being. Now, of course, I'm not talking about a new drug. I'm talking about social connection. But if this were a drug, each and every one of you would probably be asking your doctor to prescribe this for you. You would want to invest in this company. And what I would like to argue is that we should be equally as motivated to invest in our social connections. And so I just want to thank you so much for your time and for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. We appreciate everything that you say and much more informed about all of this now. I'd like to open it up to questions. I have a couple right here, but just to remind our attendees to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll see the questions, and then I'll go through these and ask some. Now, the first one, you talked about blue zones a little bit, and how, well, the question is, do blue zones have lower issues with loneliness? And if so, why? What do we know about blue zones? What is it that they're doing? We hear and read all kinds of things about blue zones in terms of their diet or their lifestyle. But are there some specific things related to loneliness and social connections that happen in blue zones that we can learn from ourselves?
Yeah. So I've traveled to a few of the blue zones and have gone back again and again each summer and have become really close and with some of the locals. And uh, uh, first off, I want to just acknowledge that these blue zones are in a way almost like outliers. They're these kind of rare instances, right, where there's a higher percentage of people who are living past 100 in a particular area. And you're right, a lot of the attention has been focused on diet and exercise, but these blue zones, these communities are very tight-knit. They look out for each other. I'll never forget one of the centenarians that I met. His name was Zio Giulio. He was 105. He was still riding his bike every day, shopping, writing poetry, acting in the local theater. And what was so interesting is my group, we met with him, talked to him, interviewed him. And it was so interesting because we then, said our goodbyes, went, had some lunch, and then decided to stop at a art museum afterwards. And here he comes riding his bike and showed up at the art museum. And the person who is over the museum asked him, how did you know that these folks were even coming here? Because we only decided to go to the art museum while we were at lunch. It was not planned. And he just turned and he's like, do you think there's anything that goes on in this town that I don't know about? And I mean, he's so well connected, but he's just one person. In all of these villages, people look out for each other. They bake bread for each other. They leave their keys in the doors for each other in case someone needs something. Um, they in one of the blue zones in Greece, they have festivals where they will raise money for those in need and to do community kinds of work. And of course, you don't have to go to a blue zone to see these kinds of communities, but certainly that is something that is part of these communities that is and in fact, because they are such isolated, remote villages, they almost by necessity need to rely on each other. And so that may be a very big contributor as well.
Okay. This question is related. You may have answered this, but let me ask this question, several questions here. Is there greater loneliness, social isolation in some communities, cultures than others? What do the more social cultures do to maintain the connections with those adults who might tend to isolate themselves? And what can we learn about those methods to transfer them into our own experiences with those who choose to isolate? I don't know if you had already answered that, but are there other things
Yeah, I mean,
related?
that's a multi-part question, so I'll try and get at a few of the aspects of it. So yes, there is variation across the world in terms of loneliness, and interestingly, it's not in the way that we might expect. I think in some ways we might think that more individualistic kinds of countries would be higher in loneliness, whereas more collectivistic kinds of countries but it doesn't seem to distribute along those kinds of cultural lines. We also, interestingly, in the Gallup survey of 142 countries, there were 29 countries in which loneliness was more than a third of the population, and 22 of the 29 were actually in Africa. And so that I think is somewhat surprising because I think we also think of loneliness as being a kind of a maybe even a US problem or maybe a wealthy nation kind of problem. But really, it's a global issue. Now, the other question in that was how do we help the people, especially those that actually are choosing to be alone? Am I right on that?
Yes, yes.
Um, and that's, I think, a trickier one because, of course, we want people to have autonomy, and yet we do have evidence that that isolation, even if it's independent of loneliness, still is associated with risk. And what is somewhat interesting is that, and we can kind of understand this from a biological perspective, is that as kind of like a homeostasis, particularly as we spend more and more time alone, we as humans adapt to that and create a new set point to the point where then the previous level of socializing might be felt as too much, kind of like the person who has gone without food for so long that then when they try and eat a normal portion becomes, physically ill. And so what's unfortunate is all of the things that we have now become really accustomed to that are such conveniences in our lives. Um, uh, all of we can get all the entertainment we want from home. We can order and shop from home. We can do almost everything from home. Um, And so these are incredible conveniences. But what they might have inadvertently done is reinforce our isolation. And so, what I would argue is that we need to simply kind of ease in, just like you would ease into, eating food again, right? You need to ease into that. And it might feel a little bit uncomfortable. You don't, of course, you don't want to gorge right away, but if you can ease in there, that can start to kind of build that social muscle again, and increase that comfort level. Uh, I've seen it time and time again where people who were maybe a little bit uncomfortable, and kind of pushed them outside of their comfort zone, ended up having a good time after all. And so, but maybe just ease into it.
Here's another interesting one about hearing loss
Mm.
and how people become isolated. I have some friends that have hearing loss. I'm sure we all do as we get older. But the question is, hearing loss is a risk factor for loneliness and isolation. Up to 70% of older adults have some degree of hearing loss. Can you comment on the importance of hearing loss and any advice you may have for older adults or who are in denial or not seeking care for their hearing loss?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. It has been shown over and over again as a significant risk factor. And it makes sense because if you can't hear the conversation, you're likely to withdraw from the conversation. You may, also, those who might be experiencing hearing loss may not want to, they may not want to engage socially because they may be embarrassed by it. Um, and but what's interesting is there's also evidence to show that untreated hearing loss can also put people at increased risk for earlier dementia as well. And so I know a number of researchers, organizations, are really advocating for hearing loss treatment, because that can that's what we would call like low hanging fruit, in the sense of that is something that is easily intervened upon. The underlying cause is clearly identifiable, and there's something that we can actually do about it. There are many other kinds of cases that are far more complex and challenging. I've talked to older adults that live in areas where the crime is high and they don't feel safe going out. That kind of underlying cause is far more difficult to address. Untreated hearing loss, is something that is within our grasp that we can and should take action on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's also a question about technology, whether it's meeting by Zoom, which we're doing right now, and many of us have experienced quite a bit over the past 4 years because of COVID, but also because of the convenience. And the question here, and I'd like to add to this question as well, is can you share more about the value of social connections via technology? For example, Zoom, and they mentioned community meditation, yoga, for example. Are there negatives to online connection versus in person? And I'd like to add to that the role of technology, whether it's social media that we hear about the effect on younger people, but also the effect of social media, either negative or positive, in that it provides an additional way for people to make connections when they can't do it in person. At least it's a supplement. It's something else that they can do. But I'd be interested. I think we'd all be interested in your perspective or your thoughts about the positive or the negative parts of the entire range of social media electronic connections that we have available to us today.
I mean, as you just described, there are so many different kinds of tools, platforms, environments that can be utilized, and so it's really hard to lump them all in one bucket, as all good or all bad. And in fact, they're so nuanced, and we do have evidence of both potential benefits and potential harms. And so you mentioned some of the benefits of being able to connect to people who are geographically separated from us. It might be, a child or grandchild that lives across the country or in another country for that matter. Um, it could be staying in touch with a dear friend that no longer lives by. It might also be finding a community, um, and so but there's also potential harms of these tools as well. So the not only the kinds of uh, um, conflict and discourse that can sometimes occur online that is potentially negative, a lot of conflict, and can often lead to misunderstandings even between people that you do know, and people you don't know, potentially making comments and doing things that they wouldn't necessarily do when you're face to face. But there's also the potential risk of uh, um, displacing the time that you would spend with someone in person versus connecting in person. And so if you have an option to be in person, that should always be your first choice. And certainly that when we are with others, to give them our full attention and not be distracted by other kinds of uh, digital kinds of tools. And so I think it's a mix of positive and negative, and it's how we use them. And and so it's really about harnessing the positive and trying to limit those kinds of influences that may be more detrimental.
Okay. Well, we have about 5 more minutes or so, and I want to be certain to get to this question from the president of our association, Roger Baldwin, who is asking, how can retirement organizations like AROHE help to support social relationships for retirees of all ages and different stages of life? Should we be considering targeted programming for these different groups? Kind of a broad question, but what can we
Yeah.
do our organization to help our retirees?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's a kind of a couple of I guess recommendations that percolate as soon as you ask the question. The first is that you can be an incredible resource for retirees. So helping to raise awareness, as I mentioned, we have good data that most people really view this as relevant to maybe their emotional well-being, but less so related to physical health, cognitive health, mental health. Um, and that this is really important because how people engage with their healthcare providers can be really important, and the kinds of conversations that they have that can help prepare them can be really intervening early, and prevention is going to be key. And so the more that retirees can be aware of this, the more they can take action uh, that can prevent becoming isolated, but also to really invest, of course, in their social connections. The other is investing in various resources, whether that is programs or other types of resources that can, as you mentioned, be tailored to various kinds of needs. And there are a wide range of needs. We are diverse humans and have varied kinds of life experiences, varied preferences, varied cultures and backgrounds. And so, and our, 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 our access to various resources can vary greatly as well. And so ensuring that there may be opportunities across these variations And we know that no one size fits all approach works for everybody. And so rather we need to have more tailored kinds of approaches. And so investment in this can be really helpful.
Okay, okay, thank you. Let me finish with this question. What do you recommend as a starting point if you are not retired yet, but pondering soon? So those people that are in that intermediate phase of thinking about it, then transitioning to retirement, into retirement, like a lot of things, preparation can lead to a much smoother transitions in our life. What are your thoughts about that? What are some things that people can do that are thinking about retirement?
Yeah, I'll share kind of an anecdote because, having traveled to these blue zones, I, have this tempted like, oh, like my husband and I, we should retire to Italy. That would be so great, right? But then I realized, I'm like, put on my expert hat. I'm like, but I don't speak Italian.
Uh,
My husband does, but I do not. And I thought, you know what? If I do that, I won't be able to speak the language. I might not make friends and I might be really lonely. And it's really far from my family. It's really far from my kids. And, I share this anecdote, not just to embarrass myself, but I think it's a common thought of we often may want to go retire somewhere else that is different from where our roots are and where our social network is, and where our support system is. And so, as tempting as that can be, um, as we age, we may need greater support, and having a network around you for support, but also just the making those last years really incredible, right? You want to be around the people you love and care about. um, but also I think it's really important that we invest in our relationships early, because it's often hard to make new friends, and so maintaining those relationships over time. If you want to have good friends, you got to be a good friend. So it's really investing in those relationships and maintaining them, so that you have that social network, throughout life.
Okay. Well, Julianne, thank you very much for this delightful, very informative, fantastic presentation. A lot of information there. And as a reminder for everybody, we'll be posting this video with links on the AROHE website. And I think our executive director, Sue Barnes, will also be sending a follow-up email with all the links and all the information. So thank you again very much. Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I'd now like to move over to our panel discussion, if they could bring up their video and audio. We have three panelists, and I've asked each of them to answer a few questions, and I'd encourage our attendees to submit questions for our panelists as well, again, by clicking on the Q&A button and submitting questions there, and I'll moderate this Q&A session. But I've asked each of them to answer questions based on their personal experiences. They may have some academic technical expertise, but I've asked them to look at this from a slightly different viewpoint of what they've experienced personally in their lives with their transitions into retirement, as well as the experiences during their retirement years. Again, please submit your questions for them through the Zoom Q&A button. Our three panelists, I'll start with Kaye Jeter, retired from Central State University as the dean of their Dayton campus. She also served at the university as the dean of the College of Education and the director of the Institute of Urban Education. She has written and published 5 books since her retirement, including the most recent one, Transitioning to Retirement, which is this one. Oops. Is it in focus? It's not in focus. No, that doesn't work. Sorry, Transitioning to Retirement. You can't ride a camel for the rest of your life. It has a green cover. Our next panelist, Valerie Ventre-Hutton, worked in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors before retiring from UC Berkeley in 2020. She is active with groups that support climate action, positive civic engagement, and have fun doing it. She and husband David live in Northern California with families scattered throughout California, the US, and Europe. Our third panelist is Louise Nasmith. Was an academic family physician. She held senior administrative positions at McGill, the University of Toronto, and the University of British Columbia. In 2019, she decided to retire and now enjoys hiking, volunteering for various organizations, and caring for her grandson. So welcome, all three of you. So I have a few questions for each of them to begin with, and I'll also be looking at the Q&A section. But the first one, and I'll start with Kaye for this one, and then I'll ask Valerie and Louise to answer this as well. But what have been some of your successes and challenges with social relationships and your transitions into retirement? Okay.
Well, I want to thank you for starting with me, because I am going to tell you that I had no good examples. I did not I did not plan to retire. And I'm speaking to all of you who have not made that decision. And I didn't make it because I honestly believed that one day I would go to work and I would die on the spot. And that was my belief. And one of the reasons I couldn't plan is because I was afraid of change. I just did not want things to change. I liked who I worked. I liked what I was doing, but change is inevitable. And whether we want it to happen or not, it does. So I retired, and 2 months before I retired, I was a full-time caregiver for my mother. And 2 months before I retired, she passed. And the day I retired, these are social relationships. My brother, who was in the city where I was, he passed. And so that's how I started my unplanned retirement. And I say this because, in addition to the fact that everything was changing, I had not made plans for any of this. And that is one of the reasons. I know Eric tried to hold up a book, but I really do have a story, because it took me a while to learn how to do anything. So everything that happened initially was an accident. It was not planned. The first accident, and it's a good one to start with, I got back in touch with a school friend, someone I grew up with. So don't discount the people that you knew when you were young, because she retired with the same age and she retired at the same time. And the two of us were able to travel for a while. And it was through the traveling that I one day said, I can't just keep doing this. I need to have some relationships. I need to do something. And so for me, things began to change only because I accidentally found out about a program that was hiring retired professionals and working with nonprofits. And that started a whole just new life for me. And I'll stop right there. But I have a book that tells the whole story. And it is a story that, the good news is that I have been able to take what I didn't do right and put it in a book to help all of us not to put off planning and not to put off establishing personal relationships.
Okay. Thank you, Kaye. Valerie, just as a reminder, what have been some of your successes and challenges with social relationships and your transition into retirement?
So first, I want to thank Kaye, who continues to be a true educator, period. I was lucky. One of my colleagues retired early. She just wanted to retire early. She had a lot of things she wanted to do. And she came back to visit us at work about 3 months after she retired. And she said, the thing you're going to forget is how many social relationships you have at work. And she used that term, relationships you have at work. So when you retire, that's gone. You don't have it anymore. And so I want to thank Edith Ng, wherever she is, for that brilliant piece of advice. So it started me thinking. And I planned on retiring in 2020. And my retirement party was February 28th, 2020. And 2 weeks later, the university closed down. I was really lucky. That's one of those accidents, it turned out well because everyone switched to Zoom and other forms of connection. So, and because of everything going on, they asked me to continue working part-time. So one of the things I'm going to share with folks, if there's any way you can cut down on work, to ease in or transition out, it's remarkably helpful. Again, it's what Kaye said, it was an accident. That wasn't planned, but it was a very, very positive one. The other thing is, I'm going to say some of my successes, because of my friend Edith, I knew I was going to need schedule because I need a schedule. So I tried to find organizations and develop new connections because I worked outside of my hometown. I didn't know anyone locally. And so I did start looking at volunteer organizations, getting rid of some of them because they weren't right for me, and over time building. So one of the best things I've done is volunteer. It's just, I got to do the stuff I wanted to do for a living but wasn't trained. So now I actually do environmental advocacy, things like that, things that I wanted to do, which is great. The other thing is, because a number of my old friends also retired, my old connections we have time to strengthen, because again, we didn't live close to each other. And so now we have more time to do that. I can bring over chicken soup if I need to. So there we go. Challenges are learning to structure my day. I'm still really bad at that, and I can get too involved in email. There we go.
I have a question about volunteering, but before we get to that, Louise, what have been some of your successes and challenges with social relationships and your transition into retirement?
So thank you, Eric. And I actually want to thank Julianne for a really excellent, excellent presentation. I learned a lot, and my co-panelists for sharing their stories. When in preparing for this, I started to think about the social connections that I have and went a little bit deeper to say, why do they actually matter to me? Because sometimes we think it's just a matter of, well, you make friends or you do whatever. But what I've learned, and I learned it also kind of by happenstance, Kaye, it wasn't, I sort of fell into something that I wasn't planning on falling into. And that had to do with the hiking group. The focus I had was hiking, but what I ended up discovering and finding was a group of friends. And all of a sudden, that piece of our hiking group became almost more important than the hiking.
Mm-hmm.
But as I delved into thinking a bit more, but how come, why? What I realized as well is I actually did lose something when I left the university, and that was a group for whom I cared. And this group of hiking women have become a group, I really care about them, and they care about me. And that caring for me is important. For others, the social connection may be sharing ideas. As academics, we love to get out and debate, etc. But for me, it was that caring piece that had always mattered to me and that I found. So I guess and it probably falls into that for the functional factors that Julianne mentioned in terms of social connections. So I think if I were to give any advice to individuals, it would be, as you plan, start to understand what does matter to you. And really what, not only your values, but in those social interactions, the relationships, what do you really value and what matters? And as you then explore, because you should explore the various options out there, try to connect to that piece and see if you can find it. Because you may, and I also ended up volunteering in a group, and I realized probably after a couple of years, it wasn't working. And I realized that it was because there wasn't that sense of caring among the group. They had a focus on something, but that something wasn't enough for me. So I guess that's my message to you. Try to do a little bit of thinking about what really matters to you before you just jump into something. Because sometimes jumping too quickly can potentially be a negative experience.
Okay. Well, thank you. There's a question here about the volunteering and what they're asking. And Louise, I'll start with you. I've tried volunteering with different organizations, but so many activities are too physical for me. Any suggestions? You talked about hiking, but if somebody can't hike, well, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, there are plenty of, and probably for this particular person, trying to know what are the volunteer opportunities out there. I think one of the questions that AROHE asked was, how does an organization help? And it just turns out that I got an email before our session from a colleague, a friend, in the College of Professors Emeriti here at UBC, and they have put together a list of 85 different volunteer opportunities, organizations that the members have been able to volunteer for. And I think being able to broaden out the repertoire. So if we could find those where you wouldn't necessarily have to be packing boxes or lifting things or standing on your feet for hours on end, that would be the way to do it. Ask around, but I certainly can understand that some of the volunteer, and I mean, hiking, I do volunteer to organize our group, and hiking just as a passion, and I'm very fortunate that I can do it. But there are other ways of being able to volunteer that potentially use your head more, or you could drive if you can drive and drive people around. So there are different ways, but if you can, go back to your university and see if they've got a list, or talk to people and put that as a focus.
Okay, thank you. Valerie, do you have thoughts about other volunteering? Or Kaye, you have a thought. Go ahead.
Yes, I just contributed an article that's in AROHE about volunteering, and this was my specific task when I was volunteering under the Encore program. And one of the things that I was helpful in doing was doing what we call a volunteer fair. So what I'm suggesting is that if you have an organization or you've been in an organization, go to your local library and it suggests that. And then what we were able to do using their resources was to go out and contact organizations and say, look, there's no cost here, but you come and set up a table and you can teach. This is specifically for older people, especially for older people. And while they were going around and they were investigating, we had interviews from people who were currently volunteering in various organizations. So it was just the right atmosphere, and the organizations were extremely happy. And I had a lot to do with that because I understood the necessity for doing in my accidental job. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Kaye. Valerie, did you have some thoughts about volunteering, especially things that might be more suitable for somebody that where volunteering might be too physically intense for them?
I don't know how first of all, I don't know the person's interests.
Yeah.
And can't be super helpful that way. I'm sorry. I can just say that by accident, the type of volunteering I tend to spend a lot of time on happens to use Zoom, and I'm online. And it happens to be involved with tracking legislation. As I said, this is not everyone's cup of tea, believe me, but it is, it's something you can do sitting down. A lot of my connections are throughout the state of California. I'm not going to go visit them in person. So it's really trying to find the fit. So Louise's idea of either finding an organization or Kaye's, I don't know where the person lives, but is there something called, is it Volunteer USA, where you literally can plug your name in and things come up in your zip code? Forgive me, I wish I knew the particulars.
Yeah. I know there's some AARP related volunteer activities as well. There are places you can go in your local area and you can click into it and find those things. I have another question here. Now, I think this was maybe intended for Julianne, but I think it's something appropriate from your personal experiences, how you might answer this question. As you get older, and Kaye, I'll start with you. As you get older, it gets harder to make new friends, especially among younger generations. What suggestions can you make for establishing new friends as you age, and also making friends across a very broad spectrum of people in all the different ways that you can think? Or are your relationships more, I don't know, in our age bracket only? So, Kaye, what thoughts about that?
Yes, that's a very good question for me. Another accidental thing. I am speaking to all of you who are still working. The time to start these relationships is now. And I was very fortunate because I was working in education And most of their students, they are going out into jobs, they're getting ready to do things. But this is what my students did for me. This was about 10 years ago. When I was getting ready to retire, they grabbed my phone and they put me on Facebook. And they said, we want to be able to find you, Dr. Jeter. It was a very smart move because they were able, as they needed. In my situation, they had no way to contact me at all. Once I left the university, there was nothing, no relationship to the university or anything, because that's the way it was, and that's still the way it is. So this helped them, and then they have used that, and I'm very fortunate to have long-term relationships. I go to a church with a family that I trained here in Nashville, and now their children are graduating from college. And I know all of them, and I have been an active part of that whole process. But it all started with them realizing that once we leave, it came from the students, we want to have contact with you. So for you that are working now, it doesn't have to be Facebook. I know there are all kinds of ways, but you need to establish a way for students to be able to find you with an email address or something, because that is a value. And those young people are valuable in my life because they're constantly contacting and asking good questions. And I still sit on doctoral committees.
Okay, Louise, I'd like to ask you that question as well. Do you have relationships or connections across the spectrum of all different kinds of dimensions, not only age, but other
Well, when you posed the question, I sort of went, well, I think most of my friends would be of a similar age, but we're talking about social connections. We're not necessarily talking about friends. And I think that's the importance of having social connections with younger folks and sometimes older folks, is that it broadens your thinking, right? It allows you to remain connected to a different world of thought. And again, remembering, and I think what Kaye said is really important, that those of us who were in academic or had academic lives, we dealt with students all the time. And in my case, it was younger junior medical residents, et cetera. And I just loved chatting with them. We didn't go out for coffee, we didn't have, et cetera, but at least we were able to talk and share ideas. And so looking for those, potentially getting back to volunteering, and it never really occurred to me. I volunteer at our local food bank. I was there yesterday, and there are people of all ages and of all walks of life, and having conversations with them. It's not just a matter of doing what it is your task is, but actually chatting is important. And I don't think we do enough of that. Or I love that picture of sitting on a park bench and actually striking up a conversation with somebody. We tend to think, oh, I don't want to intrude, et cetera. I think at our age, we can afford to just have a conversation. If somebody doesn't want to talk to you, they won't. But doing that on a regular basis is actually really smart, because I do think it allows us to maintain a certain joy in life, which sometimes we lose as we get older. We get very focused on ourselves, and that's potentially not a good thing.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. Valerie, same kind of question. Your connections across age ranges, across, I don't know, students, people you don't know, meeting new people. How do you expand, or what's your personal experience in kind of expanding your connections?
The theme I'm thinking right now is accidental again. And it has to do with, and I agree with Louise. For me, I wasn't in a faculty position, I was staff. And so it's different. I ran into students, but interestingly, it's some of the students I hired that keep in touch. You gave them their first job and they did okay. That was good. But the reason I'm going to say that it's really, for me, it's volunteering, because some of the organizations I'm with tend to be retired people or young people because they have time. And that's where, as Louise pointed out, that's where just having conversations or getting to work on projects with people, that's important.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Valerie. There's a question that says, please share Kaye Jeter's book title with our group. I unblurred my background, so hopefully you can see it right here, and it's available.
It's
I think
good.
is this in the correct direction? I reversed my video. I flipped my
You
video.
can't ride a camel for the rest of your life.
Yeah,
That
and it's
is,
available
that's
Amazon.
when I realized I was riding a camel in India while doing missionary work. And I'm saying this because it was a part of this journey I went on. And I thought that was great, except I couldn't do that for the rest of my life because I was still missing a lot of the emotional and all the things that we've all talked about. And so that's why it stuck with me that, there's more to this. And I hadn't done it right. And I really, really want to help people to do it right. So that's what that's all about. And it is my personal story. I'm not ashamed of it. And I admit I made mistakes. But I am also encouraging because I have found some answers and I speak to those answers in the book.
Okay. Here's a question related to age, but in the other direction, on the idea of connecting with different age groups. Any thoughts about connecting with older age groups? More people are living into older age, like 85 plus. The oldest old face many challenges of hearing, sight, transportation, loss of close family and friends. They are at risk for social isolation, loss of social connection. How can we, as older people and retirement organizations, connect with the oldest old and help them continue social connection? Valerie, I'll go back to you, and then Kaye and Louise. Do you have connections with older than us people?
Yeah. Again, it depends on, I mean, first of all, if you happen to be in a faith community or church group, often you'll find it there and opportunities there. But again, one of the volunteer opportunities I was with was led, and it was replanting native plants in a very harsh habitat and very hard work. And the woman leading the group was in her mid-80s. And that was just that. So I do think just opening your eyes, and it depends the environment you find yourself in. It's remarkable. Meals on Wheels is a classic where you can reconnect with older individuals.
Yep. Louise, thoughts?
I think for me personally, I can't say that I have a lot of connections with people who are significantly older than I am, and I may be the oldest in the the bunch on the screen right now, except again through my hiking group. But the women who are in our group are remarkable, who are in their 80s and are still, climbing up mountains. However, even among them, some of them do get older. And what our group has decided to do, and they can no longer hike, they don't suddenly, okay, goodbye, thank you very much for being part of us. They remain part of us. And we actually do take care of them in the sense we're aware when somebody gets ill, etc. So I think being conscious is probably what I would say we have to start doing, as well as in your neighborhood. Do you know who lives nearby? Do you actually know that you may have neighbors who are getting older and who would appreciate a knock at the door, bring them over something just to keep an eye on them? Because those individuals often, we're so busy, we don't realize that lovely couple 3 or 4 doors down, we haven't seen them very often. I think we need to pay way more attention. And that's, I think, again, what Julianne was talking about. There are small things that we could do because those people are they're at risk. And we have a role to play. It doesn't mean we have to be there every day or take over their care, but we have to keep an eye open for those individuals who can no longer do the kinds of things that they might have been able to do for themselves before.
Okay, thanks. Kaye, thoughts about connecting with older?
I think mine is a little different. I had extensive experiences with physical therapy. And my extensive experiences with physical therapy, I improved tremendously. And I would go, and one of the things that I purposely did was talk to those that were older than I am and encourage them. In fact, the PT would always say, you need to talk to her. And that was my opening into working with the older people and calling them and saying, don't give up. And so I'm saying to all of you, if you have experienced something and you've been able to overcome, there are older people than we are that need to hear that so that they're not giving up. And that's what I had. I mean, it was just hilarious to me, you know, because it's like, we need you to talk to somebody. It's like, okay. But it warmed my heart because it allowed me to continue to act like I was getting better, and also to show them that just don't give up. It was hard, but don't give up.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left, but before we finish up here, I'd like to ask each of you if you had any final comments. But before we get to that, there was one suggestion here for social involvement is to learn square dancing and join Square Dancing Club. It provides social, mental, and physical benefits. So I just wanted to be certain that we acknowledge that suggestion as well. So to finish up here, and I encourage everybody to stay on for a couple of minutes. I have a few comments about some upcoming AROHE events. But to finish up with our three panelists here, again, thank you, Kaye, thank you, Valerie, thank you, Louise. But Kaye, any final comments about anything that we may not have covered that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that change, if you are not doing anything, you are afraid of change. And I want to encourage you to cultivate connections, harness health, adapt boldly, nourish passions, give back, and energize your future. I worked on that. That's change.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kaye. Valerie, any final comments you'd like to share with our attendees that we haven't covered already?
I think reinforce the idea that give yourself time. And if something feels like it's not working, it's okay to let it go and start something else.
Yep, good suggestion. Louise, any final comments about anything that you'd like to share that we may not have covered already?
Well, certainly what Kaye and what Valerie said, I would support 100% and probably never be able to say it quite as well. I think really understand what matters to you in social connections. Spend some time thinking about that. And as you then explore options, remember that and bring that piece into it. And as you said, you've got a plan. This is not something that you fall into. And maybe my last thought would be, sometimes I think we finish and we think, oh, thank God, I'm going to be by myself. I'm going to have alone time. Isn't that wonderful? And for a short while, yes, but not for too long. And I think if anything, today's session has really reinforced that message.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Julianne. I know she's gone, but I want to thank her. This will be a recording for everybody to get a link to. Thank you, Kaye. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Louise, for your excellent discussion on a topic of importance to many of us who have experienced this with others and who may experience this ourselves. And I'd also like to thank our technical directors, Gray Kraus and Emile Nguyen, and our AROHE Executive Director, Sue Barnes. Before we go, I'd like to bring to your attention a couple of AROHE initiatives. The first one, Emile, if you could put up the Rhodes Scholar slide. AROHE has recently partnered with Rhodes Scholar to offer educational group tours for retired and current faculty and staff, as well as their friends and family. Visit the AROHE Travel Institute webpage for more information. It's on the screen here, and again, you'll get a link to the recording and the slides. The second one is on cyber fraud security, and in partnership with Fidelity Investments, we are offering a webinar on cyber fraud and personal security to share insights on protecting your financial and personal information from cyber scams. We will send a follow-up email in the next few days with the link to see more information about these initiatives, as well as a brief evaluation to help us plan future events. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you'll join us again soon. Bye. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.